Welcome to the Innovative Pedagogy Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Garcia, and today we have an episode hopefully to support all those who are potentially being overwhelmed with information on many news outlets. It's important during this specific season that we learn how to think critically, communicate effectively, and know that whatever we're going to say and share comes from a credible outlet. Because of this, I'm honored to introduce our guest, Janelle Salanga. She is currently a student at UC Davis, where she is the assistant campus news editor and a campus news reporter for the California Aggie, a student-run newspaper. In 2019, she was NPR's Next Generation Radio 2019 mentee. She is currently pursuing a degree in science and technology studies. Welcome to the program, Janelle.
Thanks, Chris. Good to be here.
Awesome. And I just want to give a shout out because she is a UC Davis Aggie. You're third year, right?
Yeah, third year. Well, I guess fourth year now school is over.
So I want to give a shout out because that's my school. That's where I graduated back in 2010. So literally 10 years ago, it was a nice hot June weekend, very similar to the one that we're about to go into. But I found Janelle because she is one of 6 journalists or student journalists that are working with CalMatters, which is a news outlet by our state that has provided a lot of very important information during this pandemic, and also, of course, during the challenges we're dealing right now with the racial tension going on within our country. So how did you get selected for that, Janelle?
So that's actually a pretty funny story. As a campus news reporter, I've been covering the cost of living adjustment movement that started from graduate students in UC Santa Cruz for about 3 months now. I guess 4 months now. And I went to one of the rallies that graduate students at Davis who were supporting a COLA were hosting, and Felicia Mello is the editor of the College Journalism Network. She's also a higher ed reporter for CalMatters. And we ended up interviewing the same person. And I guess that she looked me up online after the rally, and she connected with me to say like, hey, sorry about interviewing the same person, but I'm also, gathering this group of student journalists, and I was wondering if you'd want to come to our training. And so this training was a 2-day event in Sacramento with a bunch of workshops about, public policy and filing public records requests and stuff like that. And there were more than the 6 fellows there. And initially, I wasn't supposed to become a fellow. She had already decided on these 5 people. But during our initial conversation, I had talked to her about my interest in audience engagement and a very, this kind of reporting grounded in community, and she was drawn to that and invited me to become a fellow. So that's the long story.
That's a really good one. And congratulations. I mean, there's a lot of students that probably applied to this and probably were interested in doing this. I was really cool to see all the different UC schools that are involved as well. So again, congratulations, and I hope this next and last year at UC Davis hopefully works out to your benefit. One, where you get to be on campus and enjoy a picnic day and a graduation, and of course the famous UC Davis or the Davis farmers markets on Saturdays. That's one thing I miss.
I miss them so much. I mean, they're still happening, but they're scary to go to now. So
yeah. Yeah, I know. And in my take, it's one of the best farmers markets that we have in the entire state. I've been to different ones, even here in San Diego. They're great, but don't get me wrong, nothing beats Davis. That's one of the best farmers markets that I will always have to very high esteem. So first question I have for you is journalism. It's a very challenging type of career that I would imagine. And it's one right now, especially it's an election year. We knew that going in, but then even with all this COVID-19 information, and now with a lot of the racial tensions and different news outlets, it's how do I say it? It's a very bold career that you want to go into. So the question I have for you is, what made you want to choose journalism? Why did you want to go into this kind of career?
Oh God, that's such a loaded question. And I feel like a lot of these answers are going to be very long stories. Ironic because, as a journalist, you're supposed to distill these really complex ideas into very short, quote unquote, stories. But I actually came into science. I came into college, or came to UC Davis intending to major in computer science. So I actually have a decent amount of coding experience under my belt, because I finished all the lower division or the preparatory coursework for computer science before I completely completely shifted gears
Yes.
to focus on journalism. And I have always been really interested in stories. Like, I was a huge bookworm growing up and still am now. Because for 12 years of my life, I was an only child, and then my sister was born and everything changed. But, with two working parents, it did get, pretty lonely. And stories were kind of this thing that made me feel at home. And I guess compounded with that, I always liked writing. And um, with those two things in mind, it kind of became this natural progression of, I'm good at these two things and I like these two things. Well, what am I going to do with them? And that thought process initially led me to, I'm going to, ironically, it led me to, I'm going to do computer science because I wanted to, I guess, my parents are immigrants, and I felt this kind of pressure to enter this like high paying career. And even though I have, I knew I had these communication skills and this passion for storytelling, I ended up deciding, I'm going to enter this career because I want to make my parents proud of me. I want them to know that I'm going to
Mhm.
be financially stable. And then in the process of applying to college, I was looking for an internship because I was one of those kids that was um, really obsessed with, okay, how am I going to get into a good college or whatever. So I
Right.
saw that a lot of people had gotten internships their junior year of high school. And I grew up in Tracy, so Central Valley still. And there weren't necessarily many big companies, many opportunities, especially for someone like me who couldn't drive at the time. And on a whim, I reached out to the editor of my hometown newspaper, the Tracy Press, and was like, "Hey, would you be willing to let me intern for you over summer?" And for whatever reason, the editor said yes. And so
Wow.
that was how I got my start. Was just this random cold email that honestly changed my life, because before I had that experience, I'd always looked at Tracy as this, place that I wanted to move from, and looked at the Central Valley kind of in a condescending way. Um, but after, that summer, I really saw why a lot of people cared about Tracy. People had been in the city for generations. Like, one of the people I interviewed who really stuck with me was this jeweler whose family had a shop downtown since, I think, 1946. And that just blew my mind, that
Wow.
people love the city enough, love this community enough to make it somewhere that not only they could call home, but their subsequent generations could. And I think that kind of is what brought me back to journalism, even though I spent 2 years as like gung-ho computer science major.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is this really, like, I really like hearing people's stories, and hearing why they care about things. It's always really cool to hear about why people care about things, why
Mhm.
people believe in things, but on a more, I guess, justice focused level, because at the end of the day, freedom of the press is in the First Amendment. It's something that is a central principle of society, is having this, having journalism, having the press, being able to report on and hold different institutions accountable. And I like that. And that um being a person of color, being a woman, having all these marginalized identities is something that I'm aware of, has not always been acknowledged in newsrooms. And
Mm,
part of the reason I want to be a journalist is, as somebody else put it in this panel I attended recently, is to dismantle systemic racism.
mm,
So I also see journalism as kind of advocacy work, even if it might be too quote unquote political for some people. I don't think it's partisan or liberal or conservative to say that, journalism is a tool that can be used to break down barriers in society
right.
and take a look at these structures that we've upheld for however many years and question if they are still serving their purpose.
Right. And that's actually really important. And I think with anybody in life, you have to reevaluate. You have to reevaluate where a system, where a structure is currently at and seeing, is this working? Are the principles that were
Mhm.
established, are these the things that we're still going to uphold? And if so, why? If
Mhm.
not, why? And it's important that every generation has conversations because as you very well know, technology is progressing and to the point where I mean, if it wasn't for technology, who knows? I remember even hearing the question, what would happen during this pandemic if we didn't have technology? What if this would have happened in the 80s where cell phones were barely coming out and and how people would
Yeah.
respond? So it's one of those things and I really admire that. And that actually leads to the next question. As far as I understand you mentioned right now the First Amendment right and I remember actually one of the most challenging classes I took at UC Davis was a First Amendment class because I'm a sociology major. So it was one of the
Oh, okay.
focuses. Yeah, so I focused on law and society while I was there. So that was the emphasis that I had. So one of the classes was a First Amendment right, and we took it for the entire quarter. One of the most challenging classes. We had to memorize a lot of different trials and situations that were happening. But you bring up the very important part of the freedom of the press, and I want to bring up to our second question that I had given you already earlier. But that is in an era where there's so much information overload. So how can you encourage someone to think critically before sharing, posting, or even choosing a side?
I think the biggest thing with that is being able to slow down, especially now that with Twitter and this 24-hour news cycle on television, it's really easy to get caught up in that and feel like you always have to stay tuned in. But a lot of times, a lot of this news that is coming in is part of a bigger picture, right? It's never really just about one single event. It's about what's happening in the world and at within society at large. So one of the best things to do in terms of slowing down would be to, disconnect from social media. Um, Especially if you're not a journalist or you're not somebody who's actively teaching news, it's really helpful for you to not be engaged with what's going on all the time, because I think a really important part of it is not getting desensitized to what's happening, and
Mm,
it gets really easy to do that when you're constantly plugged in, which also leads me to sifting through that information, like as you said before, how do you decide what's credible, what's not credible, what needs more investigation? And in slowing down, you have time to pick out some things that might be suspicious to you or things that seem really outlandish,
mhm,
and kind of pick through the sources, read the article yourself, and think about, like, how was this created? Like, if I heard this tip, like, for example, oh, I don't know, COVID-19 can be killed with heat. Because I know there was this really popular, like, list of things to keep in mind about how you can prevent COVID-19 that was making the rounds on Facebook and WhatsApp
right.
and all these different kinds of information channels. And so, for example, with something like that shows up on social media, you can look up articles and see what's been done on that. Think about how you would, if you were a journalist or a reporter, how would you write an article on this topic and make somebody believe that it's true, or seek out the truth behind that, right? Because especially for reporters, our goal is to offer people the truth and to tell them what's going on. And for somebody who's not a reporter, you can mimic that same process to kind of solidify the information that you're receiving and to confirm it. Because obviously, especially right now, everything's in flux. But
Yeah.
what you can do is at least just make the most informed decision you can when sharing, and also acknowledge that, things are changing and information is coming out all the time.
Hmm.
So, you can, I've been seeing this graphic going around a lot in light of people becoming more aware of systemic racism due to the resurgent Black Lives Matter protests. And this graphic says normalize changing your opinion when new information is present. So I think that also goes hand in hand with choosing sides. You may come out as somebody who, for example, take like a Trump supporter. Maybe they supported him in the beginning, but maybe at this point in his presidency they've seen enough of the things he's done to be like, okay, well, I don't support him anymore. Or conversely, somebody who didn't support him and now does. And those two, are examples of what happens when you change opinions. And that's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing, but just something that happens based on information you have. And I guess another thing too is looking at the history of different sources and the
Hmm.
history of these outlets that are reporting. If you don't see like an outlet or newsroom reporting something, like it just looks like a notes app list of things, then it's probably like, if you use common sense, you can kind of guess that it might not be the most credible thing.
Right,
But
right.
even bigger outlets like the New York Times sometimes get things wrong because bigger outlets, don't have the bandwidth to cover localities the same way that local news can. So a lot of
Right.
time, getting your news from local news can be a better way to get, even if it's not the quickest information, more accurate information that's tailored to your community. Because even, Hassan Minaj on the Patriot Act, he did this story that talked about local news and how important it was. If you watch Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, a lot of the news clips he uses are from local news. They're not
Mm.
necessarily from big news outlets. So that's another big thing I would recommend is support local news, share stories from your local outlets, because a lot of times they're doing work that's more on the ground than bigger outlets can.
Right, right. And that's interesting you say that. I remember when this whole pandemic started, I stuck to the local news in San Diego. I felt overwhelmed when it
Hmm.
came to watching either Fox, NBC, CBS, ABC. And
Yeah.
so it's one of those things. I totally support that. And I love what you just said right now regarding people that could potentially have supported President Trump in the beginning of 2016, and then now they might have a shift, or vice versa, where people that didn't support him are supporting him now.
Hmm.
And I like what you mentioned that, because it goes to something that, as a teacher myself, I work with sixth grade students, and I work with sixth grade students all
Hmm.
year. And one of the standards that we have within Common Core is that in sixth grade, the students need to write a argumentative paper. So we need to teach them how to take a stand. But in addition to that, taking a stand of whatever it is. So, and for my sixth graders, I usually like to give them like different resources or topics of interest that are going on right now. And
Hmm.
right now, we would have a lot to write about because there's so much.
Yeah.
But one of the things though that I've always taught my students was take whatever you're going to stand on, and then you're going to have to write a counter argument. But
Hmm.
here's the caveat between both of them. The counter argument can't be, so let's just take gun control, for example. If I told a student, you want to write about gun control, how we should ban guns and whatnot, great, go ahead and write about it. Make your paper focused on that. However, I need one paragraph in there that's going to talk about what's the benefits of people upholding their Second Amendment right. And I said, and it's not for you to um, take away from your stance. Rather, it's more for you to at least be able to see both sides of the picture, and then after that, come up with a decision that you're going to stand by after that. So I just find it's you're just telling me that it's important that it's a message that I want to share with my students, saying like this is something this is a life habit
Hmm.
you're going to have to develop between now and in the future as an adult. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, so the panel I mentioned earlier, where somebody had mentioned, the purpose of journalism is to dismantle systemic racism. It was called How to Fight Racism and Not Get Fired from Your Mainstream Media Job. Because
Nice.
I know that I am very passionate about social issues or social justice issues. And oftentimes, like newsrooms see that as very political. Like
Mhm.
the default idea of objectivity is like, white, straight, cis, male, those kinds of, that standpoint is kind of viewed as the default. And so one of the things that we talked about in the panel was having this kind of both sidesism, in journalism, putting both sides as having equal importance in a story. So, for example, um, the way that the New York Times reported on Trump saying that, oh, you can drink bleach to kill COVID-19.
Right.
And a lot of people were angry about that because it kind of made it seem, that this was valid, even though there's plenty of scientific research to say, no, that is not valid.
Right.
Um, and in that panel that we talked about, one of the things we talked about was having, as I mentioned before, as journalists, our job is to tell the truth. And, part of that is understanding where people are coming from, like you
Mhm.
mentioned. Finding if you agree with why people are protesting, for example, talk to those people and understand why, and then through your reporting, let other people like know, or let people know why they should care, why, even if they don't agree. And then conversely,
Right.
if you are interviewing people who are protesting for something you don't agree with, understand why they care about that, and then relate that to other people who might feel differently. But at the same time, it's not, going back to things that aren't partisan or aren't political, or that shouldn't be both sides, like dealt with from a both sides perspective, are things like, oh, racism isn't happening, or Black Lives Matter is political. Those things are, they're not both side statements. They're just truths, like Black Lives Matter, that's a truth. Or if you drink bleach, it will kill you. That's also
Right.
a truth.
Right. Right.
So I mean, well, to be fair, I mean, Trump's not wrong in that if you drink bleach, it will kill COVID-19. If, by that he means it will kill you and also COVID-19. But
Right. I mean, yeah, there's some truth
yeah,
to that.
yeah. But the
Yeah.
point stands that like there are some things that can't really be both sides argued. But there are things like you mentioned, like gun control, that are really thorny debates that we really need to look at from both sides. Like especially because there's such heated debate over what rights are with regard to um, things like gun control, or, for example, immigration policy, or
Mhm.
divesting from different companies. All those things are things that are up for debate for a lot of different reasons. And I think it's important to also distinguish between things that are, facts, but also things that are more nuanced discussions, because it's a spectrum, right? Not everything is black and white.
Right. Right. No, and that's very, very important. And it goes back down to what you mentioned earlier, as far as things are very fluid, and at the same time, we're human beings that have evolved as far as with technology, with knowledge, with access to just being able to do what we're able to accomplish. Even myself and you, as
Mhm.
far as being minority attending UC Davis. One of the statistics that I got in 2010, actually 2008, because I had transferred to UC Davis.
Mhm.
I had found a statistic that one out of every Hispanic will graduate. And
Mm,
when
mhm.
I found that out, I'm like, all right, time to beat the odds. I'm gonna beat this odd, and I'm gonna be that one out of five. If it's only one out of five, I'm gonna do whatever it takes to do that. So I think it's very, very important that as far as us recognizing and bringing up issues and challenges, because it changes systems, it changes approaches. At the same time, even a shout out from our school, like one of my professors at Chicano Studies was Adela De La Torre, or Dr. De La Torre.
Mm.
She's now the president here at San Diego State, and it's just to
Oh,
see.
wow.
It's really cool to see that, like to see like a former professor that I had is now here locally in the city I'm living in. But to see that accessibility, and when that those things happen, when we're talking about every man, and just take the whole racial tension right now. But I mean, I'm a big believer, and I love Abraham Lincoln, and as far as like as far as every man having the ability that all men were created equal. So
Mhm.
it's that's the truth that I like to hold on to, and I think to myself, okay, how does that look like now? how can we make that thing happen? And but speaking of equity and equality and choosing different careers, because I know that we are on the top and we've been able to achieve this dream of higher education. What advice would you happen to give to anyone that's important, and any younger students, the students that I get a chance to teach and work with, and students maybe in junior high or high school that have a
Mhm.
desire to go into journalism? What kind of advice would you give them if they wanted to go into this type of career?
I mean, first of all, I'd say like it's great that you're interested. And then second of all, do your research about the career. Which sounds like okay. I guess I'll get the pessimistic, pragmatic part out of the way first because I did a lot of research when I started thinking about different careers. Computer science, journalism, um, and part of that was to arm myself for this argument against my immigrant parents, like I'm not going to go into like engineering or being a lawyer. I'm going to choose this whole other career that doesn't pay well and might result in me having a very long string of short-term jobs that result in layoffs, which isn't necessarily the situation for everybody who goes into journalism. Some
Right.
people have very stable careers, and there are different ways that you can get involved with media that don't always involve reporting. But when I say do your research, I mean look up. I guess this is more for students who are considering it towards the end of high school. Like, do your research, talk to people who are journalists in your area because most journalists are really open to talk with students and to share what they've learned. So ask them, ask them why they are pursuing it, the steps that they took, what made them keep going, even though they faced certain struggles and what struggles they faced. And I guess really think about that because I mean you can always change careers later, whether or not you enter college as a certain thing and change to journalism later or vice versa. Um, but like, I think it's important to at least know where you're starting off from and
Mhm.
what challenges you might face so that you're not necessarily surprised. You are able to, for example, save up early or get jobs and hustle, which is an unfortunate side effect of the industry. There's a lot of unpaid internships, so you have to take on other jobs, especially
Mhm.
if are a low income student and you can't participate in these unpaid internships, which is a whole other story about how journalism is super inaccessible to low income or first generation students.
Yeah.
But I guess one way to combat that is, like I mentioned, save early if you want to be a journalist. Talk to other journalists, get to know their stories, um, and just start asking questions. Like one of the basic foundations of journalism is just asking people questions, understanding where people come from, and cultivating that in your everyday life. Whether or not you end up reporting is just helpful, no matter where you go. And then another thing I want to add is that you don't necessarily have to pursue journalism as a career to do reporting. There's
Mhm.
ways that you can get involved with reporting without having to necessarily make it your whole life. Like you can work for your school newspaper, you can freelance or basically pitch articles to local papers or to outlets like her campus if you're a college student, or other youth publications like Teen Vogue, and they will pay you for your work. So that's one way that you can still get involved with reporting and writing without necessarily having to take the full plunge of saying, oh, I want to be a journalism major or pursue this as a career. And then speaking of majors, I'm not a journalism major, as you might recall from earlier. I
Yeah.
am emphasizing in data and media technologies, but obviously that's a whole different side of journalism. But I would actually say that it's been really good not majoring in journalism as or English or something like that, because being an STS major has really pushed me to think about how we make knowledge. What you know, what types of knowledge do we give credibility to?
Mm-hmm.
How is data produced, and why do we trust it? And then again, these questions of objectivity. What is this default idea of objectivity, and how can we push against that? So especially having a major like sociology or any social science major, I'd argue, is even more important for journalism than having something that's, straight up journalism, because you get to understand all these different facets of society from
Right.
an academic perspective. So while you're having these experiences of talking to people in the real world, you're learning how to code switch in a way. You're getting this academic
Yes.
jargon that makes you accessible to professors because you can speak their language, but you're also cognizant of these broader concepts that are going on in the world that impact like power dynamics and different conversations, and things like that. And then lastly, I'd say, especially if you're a low income student or first generation student, ask for what you need. If you don't know something, ask,
Hmm.
put it out. If you have Twitter, put it out into the universe. Talk to
Right.
your
Yeah.
teachers, talk to as many people as you can, and be loud about it, because even if people call you, hard to work with, ignore that, because your voices have been not really centered in like these mainstream media discourses, and they're
Right.
important to hear, because we need to disrupt like this narrative of um mainstream media being this one thing that's overwhelmingly white. I think over 80% of newsroom, or over 80% of reporters are white, and that has big implications for the types of news that we make and hear about, and the stereotypes that enforces about different communities, frankly.
Yeah.
And even whether you're contributing freelance pieces or you decide to be a reporter, your experience, your lived experience as somebody who's a minority, or somebody who's low income, or somebody
Hmm.
who's queer, that has big implications, and that's really important.
Absolutely. No, you bring up a lot of really good points, and especially when it comes to just the opportunities that anyone can have an influence regarding a lot of these challenges. I'm even thinking right now, like I'm a teacher. I'm an engineering resource STEAM teacher here within my city here in Chula Vista, where I actually teach at. So I'll have to pick your brain later on about the coding stuff. But you brought up a really big thing about code switching, and that was actually the number one thing they taught us in my first class. I did my graduate school at USD, and one of the first things they focused
Mhm.
on was code switching, and the importance of that, because there's different audiences that you have to learn how to communicate with. And one of the biggest things, even in sociology, that it teaches you is language. Understanding the
Mhm.
language is key. But I will say that even the opportunity of attaining higher education, that gives us the access that we need. That's given me the access as being a first graduate in my family, and I'm sure that, and I know that's going to give you the access in a year from now, once you have that cap and gown on and you have your diploma. That's going to open up doors. It's not easy, I can tell you that already, but it's worth it. It's worth the fight, especially once you start networking and communicating and building relationships with those individuals. So I really thank you. And is there a Twitter
Mhm.
feed that we can have our listeners come follow you at and keep in touch and see your journey, not only in education, but also eventually in the news world?
Yeah, you can follow me at Janelle, so JANELLE underscore CPP. It's a reference to C++ files, and
Nice.
I will add the disclaimer that I don't necessarily always tweet about journalism. It's a mix of like media critiques and news retweets and just random tidbits about my life. But if you're interested in that, definitely go ahead and give me a follow.
That's awesome. Well, I thank you so much for everything. And I want to thank all of our listeners today for tuning in. Please feel free to send me an email to cbgarcia@sandiego.edu with any questions or topics of discussion. Also, be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at the Innovative Pedag. So it's Innovative PEDAG. So we're now on Instagram. So follow us on Twitter and Instagram. And actually, if you're watching this right now, it's probably because you're on YouTube. So thank you for tuning in on YouTube. But either way, Janelle, thank you so much for being a guest today. And I look forward to staying in touch. And really, best of luck with everything in the future.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for inviting me again. It was really great to talk to, former Aggie, and kind of hear some of the similar experiences that we've had. So again, thank you so much for this. And I also look forward to keeping in touch with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, everyone. Have a good day.